So I was an Apple fanboy for over a decade. I had used iPhone for literally more than 10 years, and last year I finally made the jump to Android. I started out with the Pixel 9 Pro, which I loved, and then I moved to the Nothing Phone 3, which I loved even more. And that completely won me over to Android. I think I would genuinely struggle to go back to iPhone and iOS in particular, but from the very moment that I even considered switching to Android, Samsung was the one brand that I never considered once. It was the one brand I was just genuinely not interested in. I didn't like the design or the look of Samsung's, and I didn't like the look of the UI. However, over the past year, my experience with the Pixel and then the Nothing Phone started to open me up to the possibility of maybe considering trying Samsung. And then just over a month ago, the opportunity actually came up for me to trade one of my old pieces of gear for a Samsung S23 Ultra. And so I just decided to give it a go. And honestly, I realized I had no idea what I was missing out on. So let me tell you that story. So I think a big part of my expectation when it comes to Samsung comes from my dad, because he's actually owned some of the cheaper models of Samsung phones over the years, and I feel kind of like they're stuck in the early 2000s. And even just my perception of Samsungs in general is that they're kind of ugly in terms of the actual physical design, and then the customization I've found can just make them look absolutely terrible, especially when you compare them to the super clean UI of iOS. And after I powered on my Galaxy, some of these fears weren't exactly alleviated. Even though the S23 is only a few years old, the initial UI that I powered on did look somewhat how I expected it to, with the horrible home button and back button at the bottom of the screen. Plus I had a quick look at the Galaxy themes that you can install, and they were, as I expected, genuinely hideous in my opinion. But then the phone started to prompt me to update it, because again, it was a couple of years old, and it did full operating system updates literally 6+ times. And I noticed that with each update, the UI actually got more and more palatable. And I think this process really captured an underlying theme with a lot of iPhone users like myself. I think we've experienced Android back in the early days when it was genuinely pretty ugly and just not that user-friendly. But over the years, it has improved a lot. And now that I'm running the latest Samsung operating system, which is One UI 8 on Android 16, it's honestly just not that different to iPhone, and it looks really nice. Now, when I first got the phone, I made a quick unboxing video and posted it to my social media. And something really interesting happened. I actually realized that I was expecting a lot of pushback, especially from iPhone users, because I did experience a little bit of pushback when I moved from iPhone to Android for the first time. But what I found instead was that most people were actually really supportive and quite excited for me to move to Samsung. And I think this kind of encapsulates how much of this tribalism actually lives in my own head. I think most people really just don't care that much. Plus, I've also noticed that Android users are much less precious about the whole iPhone versus Android thing. And it made me think, have I just bought into this narrative that I have to pick a side and defend it? Like, these are literally just different phone brands. Who cares that much? But obviously I did. Over the next few days, I started finding just little things here and there that I actually kind of liked. The Android UI felt pretty familiar to me coming from the Nothing Phone, but there were a few little things that just popped up that I really liked about the Galaxy. Despite the fact that at first I definitely felt very overwhelmed. I felt like there were a lot of features packed into this phone, and that has been one of my biggest skepticisms about Samsung phones in general, that there's just too much going on. I think that's one thing that I always liked about iPhone. It just feels simple, it feels straightforward. But interestingly enough, I actually started getting a few setup notifications, and I got a notification about how I could turn on an auto restart feature to fix bugs as they came up. And it kind of made me think maybe Samsung actually understands that people find their phones a bit overwhelming just with how many features they've packed in. And these notifications were actually genuinely really helpful. They helped me discover some new features that I actually found quite cool and useful. There was also a little settings icon that popped up, which led me down this rabbit hole of discovering the side panels in the Samsung UI. And at first I thought it was a bit gimmicky, but I have actually been using them daily. I've started putting some apps in there that I just want out of the way, that I don't want to keep on my home screen, but I still want easy access to. Having said that, not everything was really working out for me. One thing I found really frustrating is the fact that I have to double tap to wake the phone. Literally every other phone that I've ever used is just a single tap. So I just can't understand why I can't seem to find any settings that let me me turn on a single tap to wake the screen. Let me know in the comments if there is a way to do this on Samsung. From here, a few of you guys on Instagram started to send me some tips. And some people mentioned some battery optimization tricks, which I found really useful, like turning down the screen resolution a bit. Someone also told me about the Good Lock app. I was pleasantly surprised. I found some genuinely useful stuff like custom gestures that let me open my wallet or calculator with a swipe. And it was little things like that that made my phone start to feel more like it was mine. And this is when things really started to shift for me. However, I wasn't really loving the Samsung keyboard. It just felt a bit clunky, maybe just because I wasn't quite used to the layout. And then I realized, hey, I can actually install other keyboards. And so I went and installed the Google keyboard that I had on my Pixel and my Nothing phone. And immediately I felt back at home and I was very happy with my choice. Then I took it out one night to test the cameras with the night mode, particularly on this one night where we went out to see the southern lights at a beach nearby. And again, despite the fact that this is the S23 and not the latest S25, I was very impressed. Plus, I'd actually been finding myself taking a lot more photos than I was on my previous phones. Now, I think this is partly a combination of multiple factors, including the fact that I felt like I had more range to work with the triple camera setup on the back, but I also really just liked how the photos look. I found they were turning out really nice. In some ways, I felt like the quality was somewhere between the Pixel and the Nothing phone, but then sometimes the photos I felt like would look better than both of those phones, especially when I edited them in Lightroom. And this is where I started to think, you know what, I actually think I'm not going to go back to the Nothing phone. I think it might be time to fully embrace the Samsung lifestyle, which I did not expect at all. Now, another big reason why I found myself taking and especially editing photos more was because of the S Pen. Now, when I first got the phone, the S Pen was one of the things that I was the most skeptical about. I thought it would be something that I would just never take out, I would never use, because I just couldn't see any purpose for it on a phone. I can understand a pen with a tablet, but with a phone, I just couldn't see the point. But it has actually genuinely become my favorite tool for photo editing. It's just so nice to have that extra precision, especially in Lightroom, so I can apply masks as well as even just moving sliders. It just feels so much easier and more straightforward using the pen when compared to just using your finger. I kept digging into customization options a little bit here and there, and I spent some time just customizing a few things like my lock screen, some quick settings, just little tweaks that made it feel less like a phone and more like my phone. Now at this point, I was basically committed. Despite my reservations about the design, the actual UI and the phone experience, I was really enjoying, and so I felt excited. And I decided to tell my wife. Now, for context, my wife is also a long-time iPhone user, and she still is very happily using her iPhone. But when I told her I was committing to the Galaxy, she was actually quite shocked. And I actually found that reaction really interesting. And essentially, the gist of the conversation was that she said that she would actually feel embarrassed to go out in public with this phone. And the thing is, I totally understand where she's coming from. For me, I'm now at the point where I just genuinely don't care what other people think of my phone choices. But thinking back to when I was a hardcore iPhone user, I 100% judged people who carried Samsung phones. And I realized that that has nothing to do with the actual capability of the phone itself. But I think up to a few years ago, I had this perception about what it means to own an iPhone versus what it means to own an Android, and specifically a Samsung. The first thing is I genuinely think iPhone was the better device in the early days of smartphones. So I think in the first like 3 or 4 generations of the iPhone, iPhones were just legitimately better phones. And I think Apple very intelligently capitalized on that advantage. They created this perception partly through real experience in the early days, but then continued that perception through marketing that iPhone equals premium and Samsung equals lesser than, or Android equals lesser than. But I think what's happened is that in the past 8 years, whatever it is, Android has genuinely caught up, and I think in some ways has overtaken iOS. I think maybe with the exception of the cameras, like I still think iPhone cameras are really good, especially when it comes to videos. But in terms of the overall general daily use, and especially the UI, I actually think Android, and for me, Samsung, is actually better for what I need. But the thing is, perceptions just haven't changed that quickly. I think there's a lot of people out there who've been loyal to iPhone for a decade plus who used Androids back in the day when they genuinely were worse phones. I think a lot of iPhone users just haven't experienced the modern Android. And so I think my wife's reaction and what my reactions would have been a couple of years ago really isn't about the actual reality of the features on a phone. It's more about what we perceive a phone says about us. Now, here's the really big thing that I think I realized about moving to Samsung. The thing that I really liked about my Nothing Phone 3 was that it felt minimal. It felt kind of like the phone was getting out of my way. But when I moved to Samsung, this is anything but minimal. It has so many features packed into it. And I think that made me realize that maybe minimal was never what I was actually looking for. I think it was the fact that I want my phone to get out of my way. I don't want it to tell me how to use it. And I think that's probably the crux of my frustration with the iPhone. I think for me, it had gotten to the point where it was just feeling too restrictive. And therefore, it kind of felt like it was getting in my way. I was wanting to do things with it, but it just wouldn't let me because of the way it's designed. Now, I think the Google Pixel gave me kind of that first taste of freedom because Android is just inherently more customizable. Even just really simple things like being able to speed up the animation speed just felt nice. It felt like it was letting me use the phone the way I wanted to use it. And then when I went to the Nothing Phone, I think I had that sense even more of the phone stepping back and getting out of the way because the UI is so minimal, and it gave me that sense of the phone just letting me do what I want to do. However, I think the limitation of the Nothing Phone was that it didn't have some of the features that I wanted. Whereas when it came to the Samsung, it's got all the features that I wanted and some that I don't even need. But I think the thing about the Samsung is that it lets me choose which features I do or don't need. It doesn't demand that I use it in any one particular way. For example, on the Nothing Phone, it has the dedicated button on the side that takes AI screenshots. I never used it because that just wasn't useful for me, and it didn't give me the option to remap that button. Whereas I love that I can remap the buttons on the Samsung phone to do what I want them to do. And so I think that is really the key thing for me. I like knowing that I can change things. I can round out the edges of the Samsung phone to kind of make it more me-shaped. Now, of course, does that mean that the Samsung is a perfect phone? Obviously not. There are still things that very much frustrate me about it. Like I said, that double tap to unlock. I also have found the fingerprint sensor is just not as sensitive as I would like it to be. I do find that quite frustrating. Of course, again, I'm aware that this is the S23, so maybe the S25 has fixed this issue. I still don't like the look of the squared off corners. However, ironically, I actually found that I've decided I like the experience of them rather than the look. And that's because if you think about it, any video you ever watch has square corners. No videos on YouTube or anywhere else ever have rounded corners. So it actually feels more natural somehow. Now, of course, I know the S23 Ultra has slightly rounded edges, so maybe that's the perfect middle ground. I don't know. I'm definitely willing to test it. So it's now been over a month and I'm still using the S23 as my daily phone. I genuinely love it. It feels like a really useful tool to me. I especially love that it's really genuinely getting me back into photography more, and of course that it gives me access to Google Gemini, which is so much better than Siri. But I am planning to keep this at least until I get sent a new phone for a review. If you would like to see me test out the S25, hit the subscribe button because it will help me know whether people actually want to see that. But now, should you switch to a Samsung Galaxy? I'm not going to tell you that you should buy a Samsung. I think you should buy the phone that works for you. Maybe you like the lack of customization. Maybe you like a phone that is going to tell you how to use it. I think that's completely legitimate. I still genuinely love iPhone, and I have absolutely nothing against anyone who chooses to buy an iPhone or a Pixel or a Nothing Phone or a Samsung or whatever it is. I think it's really just about what you like and what you want out of your device. At the end of the day, a phone should be what you want it to be. And that's why for me, I really like the Samsung. As surprised as I am to be saying that. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, leave a comment and subscribe. It really does help out my channel a lot. And if you're keen to hear more of my thoughts on the Nothing Phone 3, then I've got my full review of that phone right here, which you can check out.